In the last 6 years, the Attorney General's office has placed in jail over 600 sexual predators.
Wow.
Now, I have to tell you a quick aside. It is something else to see these guys at work. Because these guys, they're middle-aged law enforcement officers. They're cops. And they're trained to act like 13-year-old girls. So they're sitting there, they're reading 17 magazine. They're typing, "I'm so sure." It's something else. Another example, one I'm confident no one in this room cares about at all. The Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Texas took the lead defending the Second Amendment. We all know about the case Dick Anthony Heller in Washington, D.C., who filed a lawsuit because it was a criminal offense for a law-abiding citizen to possess an operable firearm. Texas took the lead. We assembled a coalition of states. I flew to Washington and argued in the Federal Court of Appeals defending the Second Amendment. We brought together 31 states, went before the U.S. Supreme Court, and we won 5-4. Now you notice a pattern among these. These fights keep coming and coming and coming. Our basic liberties are under assault in the courts of law, and the Attorney General is on the front line defending our liberties. And we keep winning 5-4 after 5-4 after 5-4. The last case I want to tell you about is in many ways the most scary case of all. It's a case called Medellin versus Texas. It arose in Houston in 1993, a truly horrific crime, where 2 teenage girls were walking home one night and they stumbled into a gang initiation. And 6 gang members gang raped these little girls and murdered them both. I grew up in Houston, and Houston is a city that has seen some pretty horrible things. This was a crime that really shocked the conscience of the city. These gang members were all caught, they confessed, they were convicted. The one at the center of this case, Jose Ernesto Medellin, wrote a 4-page handwritten confession where he describes without a hint of remorse, without a hint of conscience, how these little girls begged for their lives. How they said they would do anything if the gang members would let them go. And he describes pulling off a shoelace and strangling the little girls. The most chilling detail was a small fact that I'll never forget from that confession. The youngest girl was wearing a Mickey Mouse watch. And Medellin kept that watch as a trophy of the night because he was so proud of what they'd done to him. Well, Medellin was convicted, he was sentenced to death, and then 4 years later the case took a very strange turn. Because the World Court, which is the judicial arm of the United Nations, the World Court issued an order to the United States to reopen the convictions of 51 murderers across this country. It's the first time in the history of our nation a foreign court has ever tried to bind the U.S. justice system. Medellin was one of those 51. Texas fought the World Court. We took it to the U.S. Supreme Court. I had the incredible honor of arguing the case twice in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. When we stood in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, we had 90 nations on the other side. All of the European Union, most of Latin America, all were unified behind the proposition that the U.S. Justice Department should be entirely subservient to the World Court of the United Nations. And we also had on the other side the President of the United States. George W. Bush, sadly, a man whom I've spent a lot of my adult life working for, and I remain a big fan of his in many respects. And yet in this case, I think he received some very, very poor advice.
Exactly.
Because President Bush signed a 2-paragraph order that purported to order the state courts to obey the World Court. So when Texas stood before the U.S. Supreme Court, we had 90 nations on the other side. We had the President of the United States on the other side. The U.S. Solicitor General, my counterpart in the federal government, argued alongside the lawyer for the admitted child rapist and murderer. Texas stood up and defended U.S. sovereignty, and we won 6-3. That case powerfully illustrates why it is I'm running for Attorney General. For the last 6 years, we have had an incredibly principled, incredibly effective Attorney General in Greg Abbott. And when Greg Abbott moves on, The Attorney General will be on the front lines defending our liberties. We need to continue to have an Attorney General who can fight and win for the state of Texas. But that case also illustrates how, as important as the job has been for the last 8 years, it has just gotten exponentially more important. One of the leading players on the other side in the Medellin case was the dean of Yale Law School, a man named Harold Koh, who twice filed briefs against the state of Texas, arguing that the U.S. Supreme Court should be entirely subservient to the World Court of the United Nations. President Barack Obama has now named Harold Koh to be the chief legal advisor at the U.S. Department of State. So the most radical academic in the country for giving up U.S. sovereignty is now the #1 lawyer at the U.S. State Department. And a point that I've been blessed to make all across this state, for the last 6 years, Texas has repeatedly stood up and fought the federal government when the federal government was in the wrong. And if we were willing to do that when our friend George W. Bush was in the White House, how much more so do you think we'll be willing to do so with Barack Obama? Texas can lead the way, standing up and defending our nation. The last thing I'd like to do is just share a little bit of my personal story. My dad was born in Cuba. He grew up there, and when he was 14 years old, he began fighting the Cuban Revolution. He began fighting with Fidel Castro. He didn't know Castro was a communist. Most of the kids fighting with Castro didn't. They just knew that Batista was an oppressive dictator. He spent 4 years fighting in the revolution, throwing Molotov cocktails, blowing up buildings. I mean, he was a guerrilla. When he turned 17, Batista's police captured him and they threw him in prison. And they tortured him. They beat him almost to death. My grandfather found him in prison and bribed his way out of prison. And at that point, he fled Cuba. He applied to 3 U.S. universities, University of Miami, LSU, and University of Texas. UT was the first one that let him in, which is how I came to be a Texan. So in 1957, my father arrived here in Austin, Texas. He was 18 years old. He didn't speak a word of English. He had no possessions other than he had a slide rule in his pocket. Which, every time I talk to young people, they have no idea. And he had $100 sewn into his underwear that my grandmother put there so they wouldn't take it. He got a job as a dishwasher making 50 cents an hour. And he worked full time and put himself through school. And he built a future seeking the American dream. Now, I'll tell you what I find so incredible about my dad's story. Every one of us in this room has a story just like it. The unique thing about the United States of America is every one of us, whether it's us or our parents or our great-great-great-grandparents, somebody somewhere was crazy enough to leave everything and come here in pursuit of freedom. And that's the most fundamental DNA of what it means to be an American, to value freedom and opportunity. And I like to think of the state of Texas as America on steroids. You think of our state's history. You had brave frontiersmen and women that decided it wasn't challenging enough on the frontier. They were GTT, gone to Texas. And you know what? That's why what President Obama is trying to do is not going to work. Because the basic character and values of our nation are character and values that value liberty, that value opportunity, that value God and faith and family. And we are going to stand up and defend this nation, and Texas will lead the way.
Right.
It has been incredibly encouraging to campaign all over the state for 9.5 months. I'm humbled to still be the only Republican in the race. A great part of the reason is the support of so many friends in this room. I thank you for that. I need your continued help, and I will say this, I am honored to stand alongside each and every one of you and fight every single day to defend our liberty. This is a fight we're going to win. Thank you.